My name is Adam Williams. I am 19 years old, born and raised in a small town in the United Kingdom. People often say I have striking features, deep, expressive eyes that seem to hold unspoken thoughts, and a gentle smile that rarely leaves my lips. There is a softness in my face, a calm warmth in my presence, something that makes people feel at ease without knowing why. I grew up with ordinary surroundings but extraordinary dreams. I wanted more than routine, more than familiarity. I wanted to understand life in its depth, to feel its silence, its meaning, its hidden layers. That hunger for something beyond the visible world brought me far from home, across borders, cultures, and expectations. And it brought me to Sheikh Fahd bin Abdullah. Sheikh Fahd was 55 years old, an Arab sheikh of great influence, dignity, and power, a man whose presence filled a room without effort. There was authority in the way he walked, wisdom in the way he spoke, and something deeply calming, yet intimidating in his silence. I came to his mansion as a worker, nothing more. At least that is what I believed at the beginning. The mansion itself felt alive. Vast corridors, quiet courtyards, gardens that breathed peace. Every evening, Sheikh Fahd would sit on the veranda with a cup of tea, often holding an old book or handwritten letters. He seemed most himself in those hours, when the world slowed down and the noise faded. I was usually nearby. Sometimes I brought him tea. Sometimes I watered the garden plants. Sometimes I simply existed in his presence. Yet my heartbeat always felt louder than the tasks I performed. It was there, slowly and unexpectedly, that I realized something important. Being close to someone is not just physical presence. It is becoming part of their quiet thoughts. His eyes spoke to me. There were moments when no words were exchanged, yet entire conversations passed between us. A glance, faint smile, pause longer than necessary. In those moments, I felt as though he could see parts of me I had never shown anyone. Days turned into weeks. Our meetings grew deeper, softer, more meaningful. Sheikh Fahd began sharing stories of his childhood, of growing up surrounded by responsibility, of losing emotional warmth in the pursuit of strength. He spoke of joy, regret, success, and loneliness with an honesty that surprised me. I listened. Sometimes I replied. Sometimes I nodded. Sometimes silence answered for me. Yet he never seemed dissatisfied. Being with him felt like standing in a calm place within myself, a peace I had never known. His experiences, his reflections, his way of understanding the world opened my mind to a life beyond youth and impulse. That was when I understood something profound. Love is not always passion or desire. Sometimes, love is understanding, respect, and quiet closeness. In the evenings, we sat together drinking tea. He read poetry aloud, sometimes Arabic, sometimes Urdu. I didn't always understand every word, but I felt every emotion. When I responded in my simple words, he listened as if each sentence mattered deeply. When our eyes met, silence completed what language could not. One night, Sheikh Fahd fell ill. Without hesitation, I stayed awake beside him. I placed my hand gently on his forehead, whispered prayers, felt his pulse beneath my fingers. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized that the deepest form of love is care. Not possession, not desire, but protection, presence, worry. That night, I felt closer to him than ever before. Alongside that closeness, an unfamiliar happiness bloomed. Quiet, warm, undeniable. Time continued to move forward. With each passing day, our bond grew stronger. Sometimes he took me to city parks. Sometimes we sat on the mansion rooftop, gazing at the stars. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we simply sat together. Yet every moment stayed with me. I was no longer just a worker to him, and he was no longer just an employer to me. One evening, when the courtyard was wrapped in calm night air, he came closer and said softly, "Adam, you are the peace of my heart." I lowered my eyes and replied quietly, "When a man finds peace, Sheikh, he becomes grateful." That gratitude shaped our bond into something deeper. What existed between us had no need for labels. It rose above age, culture, and expectation. It was built on trust, tenderness, and shared silence. Love, I learned, does not always declare itself loudly. Sometimes, it simply remains. The days that followed carried a different weight. Nothing around us had changed, yet everything had. The mansion remained the same. Its long corridors, white stone walls warmed by sunlight, the garden breathing softly in the afternoons. But inside me, something had shifted. I walked slower now. I listened more closely. Every sound, every pause, every shared silence with Sheikh Fahd felt meaningful. As if life itself was speaking in a quieter language I was only beginning to understand. Sheikh Fahd, too, seemed changed. He spoke less than before, yet when he did, his words carried a gentler tone. His gaze lingered, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that acknowledged presence. Sometimes I would catch him looking at me from across the courtyard, his expression thoughtful, almost distant, as though he were measuring something invisible yet deeply important. One afternoon, I was arranging books in the small private library, a room Sheikh Fahd loved dearly. The scent of old paper and polished wood filled the air. I was lost in thought when I sensed someone behind me. I turned. He stood there quietly, hands folded behind his back. "Adam," he said softly. "Yes, Sheikh. You read." I hesitated. A little. Mostly when words feel heavier than silence. A faint smile appeared. "Then you understand more than you think." He stepped closer, his presence calm, unhurried. He picked up a book from the shelf, brushing his fingers lightly across its spine. "Some books," he said, "are not meant to be finished quickly. They require patience." I nodded. "Like people." He looked at me then, truly looked at me, and something unspoken passed between us. From that day onward, our time together grew more intentional. Not frequent in a dramatic sense, but deeper. Even the simplest moments carried quiet meaning. Sometimes we walked through the garden in the early evening. The air was cooler then, the sky painted in fading gold and soft blue. He would ask me about England, about my childhood, my family, my dreams. I spoke of rainy mornings, of narrow streets and familiar faces, of longing for something I could never name. He listened as if my past mattered deeply to him. Other times, he spoke of his life, of expectations placed upon him since youth, of decisions made not for happiness but for duty. He never complained. He simply shared. And I listened. It was during one of those evenings that I realized something startling. Sheikh Fahd trusted me. Trust, I learned, is a quiet gift. One night, as we sat on the veranda, the moonlight spilling gently across the marble floor, he asked me a question that stayed with me long after. "Adam," he said, holding his cup of tea, "do you believe some connections are written before we understand them?" I thought carefully before answering. "I believe," I said slowly, "that some people arrive when we are finally ready to be seen." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if absorbing the words. "Yes," he said, "that feels true." A few days later, he fell ill again. Nothing serious, but enough to confine him to rest. Without being asked, I stayed near. I brought him tea, adjusted the curtains, made sure the room stayed quiet. At one point, as I was leaving, he reached out. Not to stop me, but to gently touch my wrist. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For staying." That single word held more meaning than any long speech ever could. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my small room, listening to the distant sounds of the mansion settling into silence. My thoughts were tangled, not with confusion, but with clarity that felt almost overwhelming. I realized that what existed between us was not born of desire or impulse. It was something steadier, something chosen. In the days that followed, Sheikh Fahd began including me more openly in his quiet routines. He asked me to sit with him during tea, to accompany him during evening walks. The staff noticed, but no one questioned it. His authority was unquestionable, but his kindness made explanation unnecessary. One evening, as the garden lights flickered on and the scent of night flowers filled the air, he spoke again, this time with a softness that felt deliberate. "Adam," he said, "do you ever feel that life gives us very little, but asks us to protect it fiercely? I nodded. Yes, especially when it gives us peace. He turned to me, his voice almost a whisper. You have brought peace into my life. My breath caught, not from surprise but from recognition. I didn't plan it, I said quietly. Neither did I, he replied. There were no promises made, no declarations spoken. Yet something solid formed between us, a mutual understanding that did not need to be explained or justified. One night, while we sat beneath the stars on the rooftop, a light breeze moving gently through the air, he handed me a cup of tea. You like the scent, he said. Yes, I smiled. It feels comforting. Then it suits you, he said simply. Our hands brushed briefly as I took the cup. The contact was fleeting, but the moment stretched, suspended in stillness. I lowered my gaze, not from shame, but from emotion too large to hold openly. In that instant I knew, what we shared was not fragile. It was not rushed. It was not bound by expectation. It was built on care, presence, and choice. And for the first time in my life I felt completely quietly at home. The nights grew longer, or perhaps I simply became more aware of them. There was a certain stillness that settled over the mansion after midnight, a kind of breathing silence, deep and steady. I began to notice how Sheikh Fahd valued those hours. He did not fill them with noise or distraction. Instead, he allowed the quiet to exist, as though it were a companion rather than an absence. I learned from him that silence can be generous. One evening, he asked me to join him in the inner courtyard. Lanterns glowed softly along the walls, casting warm circles of light on the stone floor. The air carried the faint scent of jasmine. Sit, he said gently, gesturing to the bench beside him. I sat, leaving respectful space between us. He noticed and smiled. You don't need to measure distance with me, he said. Comfort decides that on its own. I relaxed slightly, not moving closer, but no longer holding tension in my shoulders. He poured tea for both of us carefully, as though the act itself deserved patience. Adam, he said after a moment, do you know why I enjoy evenings with you? I shook my head. Because you do not try to impress me, he continued. You simply exist. That is rare. His words settled inside me slowly. I don't know how to be anything else, I replied honestly. That, he said, is exactly why. From that night onward, something quietly changed. I was no longer just accompanying him. I was invited into his world. He asked for my thoughts, my opinions, my presence. Not constantly, not dramatically, but consistently. Consistency, I learned, is another form of care. Some evenings we spoke about philosophy, about the meaning of fulfillment, about the ways people mistake power for peace. Other times we spoke of nothing important at all. He would comment on the sky or the way the garden responded to moonlight. I would listen, smile, and occasionally respond. Yet every exchange carried weight. One afternoon, he asked me to walk with him through the old wing of the mansion, a part rarely used, filled with family portraits and memories preserved in frames. These are my parents, he said, stopping before a photograph of a dignified couple. They look kind, I said. They were, he replied, but distant. Love was expressed through duty, not affection. He paused, then added, I learned early how to lead. I learned much later how to feel. I looked at him then, not as a sheik, not as a figure of authority, but as a man shaped by time. You learned, I said softly. That matters. He nodded, appreciative. As days passed, the staff grew accustomed to seeing us together, walking, sitting, sharing tea. There were no whispers, no questions. His dignity ensured that whatever he chose required no explanation. One night, rain began unexpectedly. The courtyard darkened as clouds covered the moon. I was bringing in cushions when I noticed Sheikh Fahd still seated outside, eyes lifted toward the sky. You'll get wet, I said, approaching him. I don't mind, he replied. Rain reminds me that not everything can be controlled. I hesitated, then sat beside him, allowing a few drops to touch my hands. He looked at me surprised, but pleased. You didn't have to stay. I wanted to, I answered simply. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain softened, tapping gently against stone and leaves. He removed his shawl and placed it lightly around my shoulders. Not possessively, not dramatically, but carefully. So you don't catch cold, he said. I accepted the gesture without comment, my chest tightening with emotion. That night, something important happened, not outwardly, but inwardly. I realized that I trusted him completely. Trust, I discovered, does not arrive with certainty. It arrives with calm. Later, as we stood to return inside, he paused. Adam, he said quietly, there are many people in my life, but very few who see me without expectation. I met his gaze. I see you as you are. He nodded once, as if that was all he needed. The following weeks brought a gentle rhythm. Mornings were filled with responsibility, afternoons with quiet productivity, evenings with shared presence. There was no rush, no urgency, just continuity. One evening, while we sat in the library, he asked me to read aloud from a book of poetry translated into English. My voice was steady, though my heart wasn't. When I finished, he said, "You read as though you feel the words." "I do," I said, "even when I don't fully understand them." "That is the best way to read," he replied. He then surprised me by asking, "Would you consider staying longer?" Not as obligation, but as choice. I took a moment before answering. "Yes," I said, "I would." Something softened in his expression. "Thank you," he said. That night, alone in my room, I understood something clearly. What bound us was not dependency. It was mutual respect. Not longing, but recognition. And in that recognition, I felt stronger, not smaller. As the moonlight filtered through my window, I allowed myself to feel gratitude. Not for what might happen, but for what already existed. Some connections, I realized, do not need to be defined to be real. They simply need to be honored. Change rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, settles gently, and only later do we realize that something essential has shifted. That was how it happened between Sheikh Fahd and me. There was no moment I could point to and say, this is where everything changed. Instead, the change lived in the way we looked for each other's presence, in how absence felt heavier than it should have. One morning, I noticed that I listened for his footsteps without meaning to. Another day, he asked where I had been when I was only gone for a few minutes. Neither of us mentioned these things. We didn't need to. The mansion began to feel less like a workplace and more like a shared space, one shaped by routine and quiet understanding. When I entered a room, Sheikh Fahd would lift his gaze instinctively. When he spoke, I found myself listening not just to his words, but to the pauses between them. One afternoon, he invited me to accompany him on a short drive outside the city. The road stretched open and calm, bordered by desert and distant hills. The city noise faded behind us, replaced by a wide, thoughtful silence. "I come here when I need clarity," he said, eyes focused ahead. I nodded. "It feels honest out here." He smiled faintly. "That is a good word for it." We stopped near a quiet overlook. The land spread endlessly before us, simple and unadorned. He stepped out of the car and I followed. "For most of my life," he said, "my choices were made by expectation, family, society, responsibility." He turned toward me. "Do you know what frightens people the most?" I thought for a moment. "Choosing for themselves." "Yes," he agreed, "especially when the choice brings peace." I understood what he was saying, not as a confession, but as a truth he was allowing me to stand beside. That evening, something subtle but significant happened. As we sat in the courtyard, he reached for a book beside him. His hand trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from hesitation. I noticed. Without thinking, I gently took the book and placed it in his hand. Our fingers touched. The contact was brief, respectful, yet it carried more emotion than any prolonged gesture could have. He didn't pull away immediately. Neither did I. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Adam, some connections demand courage." I met his gaze. "Then courage is simply honesty." He studied me carefully, as if weighing something precious. That night, sleep came slowly. My thoughts were not restless, but full of awareness, full of quiet resolve. I was no longer unsure of what this bond meant to me. It was not confusion. It was clarity I was learning to accept. The following days tested that clarity. Visitors arrived, men of influence, relatives, people who addressed Sheikh Fahd with formality and expectation. I stepped back, returned to my role, my posture measured and respectful. Yet even in those moments, our connection remained. A glance across the room, a brief nod, a shared understanding that required no words. Later, when the guests had left and the mansion exhaled again, he found me in the garden. "I noticed how you carried yourself today," he said. "I didn't want to intrude," I replied. "You didn't," he said firmly. "You showed wisdom." He paused, then added, "But know this, you never diminish your place by showing respect. You define it." His words stayed with me. That night, as we sat beneath the stars once more, he spoke with unusual openness. "Adam," he said, "there comes a time when a man must decide whether he will live only as expected, or also as he feels." I listened, heart steady. "I am at that time," he continued. I didn't rush to answer. Some moments deserve patience. "When you decide," I said gently, "make sure the choice allows you to breathe." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly it." In that moment, I realized something profound. This was not a story of dependence. It was a story of two people choosing awareness. Later, as the night deepened and silence wrapped around us, he stood and placed his hand briefly over his heart, a gesture of sincerity. "Thank you for standing beside me," he said. I mirrored the gesture instinctively. Always. It was the first time I said that word without fear. Always. Not as a promise bound by obligation, but as a presence offered freely. And in that offering, I felt no loss of myself, only strength. Some bonds do not demand declarations. They grow stronger through consistency, through the simple act of returning, again and again, to the same place, the same presence, the same quiet truth. That was how our connection matured. Not dramatically, not urgently, but steadily, like something rooted deeply enough to survive time. I began to understand Sheikh Fahad's world more clearly. His days were filled with responsibility, meetings, decisions, expectations carried with practiced composure. Yet it was in the evenings, when formality loosened and silence returned, that he seemed most himself. Those were the hours we shared most naturally. Sometimes we walked without destination. Sometimes we sat without conversation. Sometimes we spoke of things that mattered and sometimes of things that didn't. Yet every moment carried intention. One evening, as we sat in the library, he closed the book he had been reading and looked at me thoughtfully. "Adam," he said, "do you ever feel the need to explain who you are?" I considered the question. "I used to," I answered honestly. "But not anymore." He nodded slowly. "Neither do I." And that realization brings relief. Relief, that was the word. Our connection had become a place of rest. Not escape, but grounding. We did not erase each other's responsibilities or identities. We simply allowed space for something quieter, truer. A few days later, he invited me to join him for dinner. Not as service, not as formality, but as presence. The table was simple. The conversation even simpler. At one point, he set his fork down and said, "I trust you." The words were spoken calmly, without ceremony. Yet they carried immense weight. "I won't fail that trust," I replied. "I know," he said. "That's why I gave it." Trust, I learned, is not granted after proof. It is granted because recognition has already occurred. That night, after dinner, we stepped into the courtyard. The air was cool, the sky clear. Lantern light softened the edges of the world. He stopped walking and turned toward me. "Adam," he said, his voice steady, "I have lived many years without allowing myself this kind of closeness, not because it was unavailable, but because I did not make room for it." I listened without interrupting. You did not ask for anything, he continued. You did not demand. You simply stayed. I met his gaze. Because it felt right. He took a slow breath. That is why it matters. In that moment, I understood something essential. Commitment does not always arrive with promises. Sometimes it arrives with recognition and choice. The following weeks tested that choice. There were moments of distance, days when his responsibilities consumed him, when I felt the pull of my own questions about the future. Yet even then, the connection did not weaken. It adjusted. When we finally sat together again after one such stretch of busy days, he said quietly, "Thank you for your patience." "I wasn't waiting," I replied. "I was trusting." His expression softened. "That may be even greater." One night, as we sat beneath the open sky, he spoke with clarity I had not heard before. "Adam, whatever this bond is, whatever name the world might give it, it is built on respect. If at any moment you feel uncertain or constrained, you must tell me." I answered without hesitation. "I feel neither. I feel steady." He smiled genuinely, warmly. "So do I." That was the moment I realized. We were no longer discovering this connection. We were choosing it. Quietly, repeatedly, without fear. Later, alone in my room, I reflected on how far we had come. From strangers bound by circumstance to two people bound by awareness. There was no rush to define the future. No urgency to announce anything to the world. What we shared lived where it mattered most, between us. And for the first time in my life, I understood that commitment does not always mean permanence in form. Sometimes, commitment means presence with integrity. And that, I knew, was something I could give freely, fully, and without regret. The future does not always appear as a clear road. Sometimes, it arrives as a question, quiet, patient, waiting for honesty rather than certainty. That was how it began for me. Not with fear, but with awareness that what we shared had grown strong enough to invite the future into the room. Sheikh Fahd seemed to sense it too. One morning, as sunlight filled the veranda and the day began with its usual calm, he asked me to walk with him after breakfast. We moved slowly through the garden, the sound of gravel beneath our steps steady and grounding. "Adam," he said, "have you ever been afraid of becoming something permanent in someone's life?" I thought carefully before answering. "Yes," I said, "but I've learned that permanence isn't created by force. It's created by truth." He nodded, thoughtful. "That is a wise understanding." We stopped near the fountain, water moving gently in endless circles. "I don't know exactly what the future will look like," he continued. "But I do know this: whatever direction I move in, I no longer wish to move alone." There was no demand in his words. No expectation placed upon me. Only an invitation grounded in respect. I met his gaze. "Then let it be a future where we walk with awareness." A faint smile crossed his face. "That is all I could ever ask." That afternoon, something shifted again, not outwardly, but in the way the days arranged themselves. Plans were discussed more openly. Not promises, but possibilities. He asked about my ambitions, my desire to study further, my hopes beyond the mansion. "You should never feel that your life must pause to stand beside mine," he said firmly. "Growth is not separation." Those words stayed with me deeply. In the evenings, our conversations grew quieter, more reflective. We spoke of values, of what it meant to live with integrity, to choose peace without harming others, to remain truthful even when silence was easier. One night, as the moon rose full and bright, we sat side by side on the veranda. No tea, no books, just presence. "I once believed," he said softly, "that strength meant carrying everything alone." I looked at him. And now I know strength can also mean allowing someone to stand with you." The simplicity of the statement moved me more than anything he had said before. Days later, I received a letter from home. Familiar handwriting, familiar concerns, questions about my future, about where I belonged. That night, I sat quietly, the letter folded in my hands. Sheikh Fahd noticed my stillness. "You seem distant," he said gently. "I'm not," I replied. I'm thinking. About what? About where I come from, and where I'm going. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he sat beside me. You don't have to choose one over the other, he said. You carry both. I felt a tightness in my chest loosen. Thank you, I said quietly. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of our lives continued. Balanced, deliberate, calm. There were moments of laughter now, lighter than before. Moments where silence felt less heavy and more companionable. One evening, as we stood watching the city lights glow in the distance, he said something that felt like a turning point. Adam, I don't know what name the world would give to what we share, but I know it's nature. I waited. It is built on dignity, he said, and dignity must always be protected. I nodded. Then we protect it. Together. He looked at me then, not as a sheik, not as a man defined by years, but simply as someone choosing truth. Yes, he said. Together. That night, as I lay awake, I understood something clearly. This story was never about crossing boundaries. It was about understanding them and choosing honesty within them. What we shared did not demand the world's approval to exist. It demanded only respect, patience, and courage. And in that understanding, I felt ready not for certainty but for continuity. For whatever tomorrow would bring. There comes a moment in every meaningful connection when silence no longer feels like uncertainty. Instead, it becomes confirmation. That was where we stood now, Sheikh Fahd and I, not questioning what existed between us, but understanding how carefully it needed to be carried forward. What we shared had matured beyond discovery. It had become something steady, something chosen again and again through action rather than words. One evening, Sheikh Fahd invited me to join him in a smaller sitting room, one rarely used, quiet and private. The lamps were dim, the curtains open to the night sky. This room, he said, is where I come when I need to think clearly. I nodded, sensing the weight of the moment. He sat, gesturing for me to do the same. Adam, he said slowly, life has taught me that not everything valuable needs to be visible. Some things survive precisely because they are protected. I listened carefully. What we share, he continued, exists in that space. It does not need explanation. It needs integrity. I felt a calm certainty settle within me. I understand, I said, and I accept that. He exhaled, as though something long carried had finally been set down. That night marked a quiet agreement, not spoken aloud, but deeply understood. We would continue forward with awareness. No secrecy born of fear, no display born of defiance. Just honesty lived carefully. The days that followed reflected that understanding. Our interactions became even more grounded. There was ease now, comfort without complacency. We respected each other's worlds while remaining connected at the center. When responsibilities called him away, I did not feel distant. When my own plans required attention, he did not feel excluded. Balance had replaced uncertainty. One afternoon, while walking through the garden, he said, "You've grown since you arrived." "So have you," I replied gently. He smiled. Perhaps growth is easier when witnessed. That thought stayed with me. Later that week, he encouraged me to explore opportunities beyond the mansion, education, experience, movement forward. "Whatever path you choose," he said, "it should expand you, not limit you." I realized then that what we shared was not possession. It was support. One evening, as we stood beneath the open sky once more, the moonlight softening everything it touched, he said quietly, "I am grateful. Not because you stayed, but because you remained yourself." I met his gaze. "You allowed me to." He nodded, deeply. As time passed, it became clear that our connection had settled into something enduring. Not dramatic, not fragile, not dependent on constant closeness. It existed in mutual regard, in shared understanding, in the knowledge that we had seen each other clearly and chosen to stay present. And that was enough. One night, before retiring, he said something that felt like a closing chapter. Not an ending, but a foundation. "Adam," he said, "whatever happens next, remember this. Some connections shape us not by how loudly they are lived, but by how deeply they are held. I carried those words with me because I knew with certainty that this connection, quiet, dignified, sincere, would remain part of who I was, wherever life led me next. Not as a story of expectation, but as a story of recognition, respect, and enduring presence.